There are literally hundreds of videos on renting versus buying a home on YouTube. But this one's different. Because rather than focus on all the hypothetical and complicated math, which by the way can totally be manipulated, trust me, I've been in the real estate industry for 20 years, and I can totally make those numbers look like you should or shouldn't buy just by manipulating a few key data points. So what we're going to focus on instead is what's really important and what really matters. And those are the things that the people who are both trying to convince you to rent and that are trying to convince you to buy don't tell you. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan Matthias, and this is where money meets mindset. So if you aren't subscribed already, do me a favor, give me some of those positive vibes, and hit that subscribe button and that like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's get into renting versus buying and what they don't tell you. Because regardless of what numbers you stick into a spreadsheet or a rent versus buy calculator, the reality is there is a large set of data that pretty much makes all of those calculations irrelevant. That's right, there's a significant amount of indisputable data that supports one over the other. And it's not even a question of which one makes more sense. And once you see and understand these data points, what you will quickly understand is that there's a clear winner in the rent versus buy debate. And it's not about the opportunity cost of the money that you could be using for other things or the actual cost of renting versus owning on a monthly basis. No, it's all pretty much about one thing and one thing only, and that is human psychology. It's about how we think, our habits, and what humans in general are most likely to do when left to their own devices. Which, by the way, is what most humans will do when left to their own devices. So here's the hard data. According to the Federal Reserve in the US, as of 2019, the average net worth of people who owned homes was $1.1 million. And the average net worth of those who did not was $95,000. Now, that's the average net worth. The median net worth, so in other words, if you were one of the people that fell right in the middle of all the other people, the median net worth for somebody who owned a home was $255,000, and the median net worth for somebody who didn't own a home was $6,300. And this gap in wealth between homeowners and non-homeowners continues to rise, especially as real estate values go up. And this isn't just an American phenomenon either. In fact, the same is true in Canada. Those who own a home between the ages of 60 and 70 years old have a significantly higher net worth than those who don't. In fact, the disparity in net worth is even greater than that in the United States. So what this means is that the evidence is clear, that home ownership is the more reliable method of building a high net worth. While it may not be the optimal method, it is the path to certainty. So the question is, why is homeownership such a better option than renting when it comes to building a high net worth? Well, it comes down to the psychological effects associated with owning a home. In fact, the most significant psychological effect is the forced savings effect that comes along with having a mortgage and paying it down consistently, while at the same time having the inability to liquidate the asset, the house, easily, which makes it hard to alter course and stop doing what you're doing, which is paying down your mortgage every single month and building equity. And even though these spreadsheets and the rental calculators might favor renters when all the numbers are plugged into the calculator, the likelihood of success does not. And there's a really good reason for that, and it comes down to three specific psychological factors that are at play. And I like to call this the psychology of renting versus buying. Now, the psychological difference begins at the point where somebody decides that they are going to buy a house. It comes from the actual place of setting the goal of home ownership. And that usually starts with the need to save a down payment. And the act of actually saving the down payment puts the home buyer ahead from day one. That savings process entails budgeting, saving, investing, and in general just creates really good money habits. Somebody who's saving for a down payment has to learn how to cut back on the things that are wants in order to get the thing that they need, which is the house over their head. And this creates a really strong financial foundation that some renters never find. Now, some renters are indeed good savers, but the numbers, the data shows us that the significant majority are not. Now, the second psychological effect that comes into play is that of lifestyle creep, because what the spreadsheets and the numbers and all the data shows you when you're comparing renting versus buying is a scenario where you're comparing apples versus apples properties. So in other words, is this specific property cheaper for me to rent or cheaper for me to buy? And in some cases, you may find that it is cheaper to rent that exact property than it is to buy it. However, that is a very hypothetical calculation, because what human tendency actually leads people to do is not to determine if a specific house is cheaper to rent or buy, but to determine what their budget is, and then they go about spending the entirety of their budget. So for example, if somebody has a $3,500 budget, They aren't going to look at that $3,500 budget and say, oh, well, I can rent this house for way cheaper, so I'm going to bank $1,000 a month. No, instead what they do is they look at what they could get for the $3,500. And what that leads to is renters in times where it is cheaper to rent than it is to buy, basically renting bigger and nicer houses. So instead of settling into a house that they can afford and that is theirs, they decide to borrow a house for a significantly higher amount. And this is the exact reason why those spreadsheets and those calculators that are designed to help you decide between renting and buying don't work. It's because even if you determine that it's cheaper to rent, the money is typically already spent on other lifestyle factors before you ever get a chance to save it. Oh, and then there's one more big problem, and that is that people have a really hard time looking far out into the future. So when those calculations are made on whether it makes sense to rent or buy, they're typically made by only looking at present factors rather than future ones. And one of the biggest mistakes that people make is ignoring the fact that when you purchase a home, you are more or less locking in the cost of living for a significant amount of time. Now, yes, there will be certain cost increases. However, the price of the property on the day you buy it will always be the price that you bought it for. And depending on your mortgage, the amount that you pay should be locked in for a pretty significant amount of time. Now, one might argue that rents are an all-in cost and you aren't going to be responsible for other costs associated with owning the home. However, that's a fallacy, because if you are indeed renting, you are indeed paying for that home. And any increases in costs will typically be reflected in higher rents down the road. And over time, with certainty, eventually the cost to rent will catch up to the cost of home ownership. Sometimes very quickly, and sometimes over 5 to 10 years. But it will in fact catch up. And the longer you rent, the more time that you've lost to build equity. Now, on top of that, there's a whole bunch of other issues associated with renting and associated with owning. And I'm not going to try to pretend that renting and owning both don't have their benefits. For example, if you're looking to live in an area for a very short period of time, well, the costs associated with buying and selling a house probably don't make sense. But keep in mind that people often underestimate how long they're going to live in a home. In many cases, if somebody thinks they're going to live in a home for 1 or 2 years, they often end up being there for 5 to 10. But in the same vein, if you want to live in the same place for an extended period of time, renting can cause a significant amount of grief, and it can also end up costing you significantly more, especially if for some reason you are forced by the landlord to move out of the property. Or if you happen to be in an area that doesn't have rent controls, the landlord increases your rent significantly in order to cover higher costs. So at the end of the day, renters end up paying all the costs associated with home ownership. It's the reason why landlords can buy properties and get cash flow. It's because the cost to live there almost always eventually balances out and ends up costing the renter more than what it costs the landlord to hold that property. And in addition to the fact that eventually the renter ends up paying more anyways, you cannot deny the negative effects associated with being a renter versus a homeowner when it comes to your net worth over time. And not only that, it turns out that the less money you make, the greater the discrepancy between what your net worth could be and what it will be if you're a homeowner. So clearly, the best investment anybody can make is in a single family home. And if you want to see another video on the optimal order to invest your money, which includes owning a home, make sure you check out this one right here.